In today's episode, we go over some of the most horrifying bear attacks told on the channel so far. From man-eating black bears to a murderous brown bear, these are some of the most horrifying bear attacks you'll ever hear. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. Welcome to Final Affliction. The Hula Hula River runs through Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It is a popular whitewater rafting route, and some claim it offers an unparalleled experience. The river weaves between the foothills of the mountains, carves its way across open plains, and emerges out into the Beaufort Sea. Along the way, visitors can expect to see a huge variety of bird life, as well as large mammals such as wolves, caribou, and grizzly bears. Venturing out into such wilderness doesn't come without its dangers, but when the necessary precautions are taken, that risk is minimized. At least that's what Richard and Kathy Huffman thought when they packed for a recreational rafting trip in June 2005. Richard was a 61-year-old lawyer working for electric and telephone utilities in Anchorage. He was a partner in his law firm, Temple, Huffman & Ellis. He had received his bachelor's degree at the University of Kansas and had served as captain in the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General Corps. When he had time away from work, he was always off on long camping trips, enjoying the outdoors and the freedom away from the office. Catherine, known as Kathy to her friends, had taught in the Anchorage School District for many years. Her love for nature and the outdoors came across in the way she taught her elementary school classes. She would always have the children outside learning whenever she could, surrounded by the sounds of nature and appreciating all things big and small. She had more recently taught at Birchwood and Lake Otis elementary schools until she retired in 2002. Richard and Kathy married in 1989 and shared their love for the outdoors together. They were incredibly safety conscious, especially when it came to wildlife and the threat of grizzly or even polar bears in Alaska. If they were rafting and camping, then they often stopped off at one location to eat their dinner before jumping back into their boat and floating downstream to another place where they would set up their camp. They knew the risks of leaving food or the smell of cooking at a campsite, and they wanted to avoid those risks. Richard and Kathy set off down the Hula Hula River in June 2005. Their expedition would take 2 weeks to complete. It was the perfect trip, a mixture of wildlife and scenery, as well as adventure and exploration. They paddled down the river in their inflatable kayak. All their gear was secured inside the boat, and at the end of each day they turned into the bank and hauled the kayak up onto dry land. They set up their campsite, listening to the rushing water as they lay in their tent each night and drifted off to sleep. Towards the end of their trip, they finished eating their evening meal before packing up. They then drifted downstream a little further and found the perfect place to set up their camp. They erected their tent in the heart of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge along the coastal plain. At over 19 million acres in size, the refuge is the largest national wildlife refuge in the country, slightly bigger than the Yukon. It is being heavily debated and fought over for its rich oil reserves and its abundant wildlife. Since 1977, controversy has surrounded the debate, with governments eager to cash in on the oil and wildlife conservationists and natives desperate to preserve the natural beauty of the region. Any food Richard and Kathy had was secured in bear-proof containers and set a long distance away from their tent. But it wouldn't make any differences that night. Their fate had been sealed. The refuge is one of the few places in the world where black, brown, and polar bears live together. But that night it was a healthy 5 to 7-year-old male grizzly that was on the prowl. It wasn't starving, and it wasn't in bad condition, but it was on the hunt. It raised its nose in the air, smelled the Huffmans from a mile away, and walked towards their riverside camp. Richard and Kathy were tucked up in their sleeping bags, warm and cozy inside their tent. They only had a couple of days left of their adventure, and then it would be back to the real world. They relished every minute they had in the great outdoors together. It had been a successful trip, and they were lucky they could share it with each other. As their eyelids grew heavy and they drifted off to sleep, the grizzly bear made its approach. It walked boldly forwards, its head swaying slightly as it sniffed the ground. It could see the tent and smell the two people inside. They were easy prey, an easy meal. Its large, muscular shoulders were covered by thick brown fur. Its eyes glistened in the moonlight. Its huge paws trod silently over the rocky shoreline. Any scuffs from its footsteps on the loose rocks were muted by the rushing river. Only when the bear was centimeters from the outside of the canvas did Kathy awake and nudge Richard. The two of them could hear the sniffing of the bear right outside. Their hearts thundered in their chests as they held their breath, not daring to move or make a noise. Inside their heads they prayed the bear would leave them alone, that it would lose interest and turn the other way. It was not to be. Suddenly, the bear slashed through the side of the tent and launched its attack. It leapt on top of them, pinning them down as it brutally mauled them and swiped with its powerful paws. The hits were like a steam train knocking the air from their lungs. The stale stench of the bear's breath filled the tent as it grunted and growled just inches from their faces. The couple tried to curl up into a tight ball, protecting themselves from the attack. They braced themselves for each hit, but the attack went on and on, cracking their ribs and smacking their backs. The bear didn't let up. Richard and Kathy were trapped inside their sleeping bags and couldn't escape under the immense beast as terror rained down upon them. It happened so quickly that neither Richard nor Kathy had time to use their bear spray or pull out their firearm. It was a savage and rapid attack. The 300-pound bear sliced at the couple in their sleeping bags, cutting through skin and muscle without giving them the chance to fight back. Their screams and shouts went unanswered in the still of the night, their cries for help swallowed by the rushing sound of the Hula Hula River. The following morning, another rafter made his way down the river. He too was nearing the end of a long and successful trip from the Romanzoff Mountains towards the Beaufort Sea. When he rounded a large, sweeping corner in the river, he spotted the remnants of a camp on the shoreline. He could see the remains of a tent, torn and battered, some equipment strewn far and wide, and an inflatable kayak pulled up out of the water. This didn't look like good news. He pulled his boat to the side of the river and climbed out, scanning the surrounds for any signs of wildlife. He cautiously walked towards the tent. He couldn't see anybody there, but as he neared the tattered tent, something brown came crashing out of the undergrowth. It was the grizzly bear. Its ears were pinned back. Its stocky body was powerful as it thundered towards the man. He instantly turned and jumped back into his raft and paddled furiously away. Glancing back over his shoulder, he saw the bear slowing down and coming to a halt as it watched him paddle into the distance. He made his way downstream, determined to find help. The small city of Kaktovik was 12 miles away on Barter Island. After what seemed like an eternity, he arrived on the island and was able to notify the authorities. A helicopter was immediately dispatched to the location from Barrow. As North Slope Borough search and rescue circled the scene in the chopper, the grizzly bear came rushing out of the undergrowth once more. It was defending its cache and still posed a significant risk to rescuers. It was shot, and authorities were able to investigate properly. They tragically found Richard and Kathy still in their sleeping bags, lying still and bloodied. They had succumbed to their devastating injuries, but the bear had not fed on them. They suffered from multiple cuts and slashes from the bear's claws, which were not survivable. The bear's body was sent to Fairbanks for a necropsy. It was found to be a healthy, well-nourished bear that was in peak physical condition. When Fish and Game wildlife biologist Kathy Harms investigated the scene of the attack, she identified it as a clear-cut predatory attack. The state of the camp was a model of how to do it right, with everything that could be considered an attractant to a bear stowed away securely and at a significant distance from the camp. The couple had not made camp on a known bear route and had obviously eaten their food at another location rather than outside their tent, but still their efforts were no use. Every other year, a person is killed by a bear, usually a grizzly, but this is normally when they are defending young or a food source. 2/3 of bear attacks are on hunters who surprise the bear in the remote wilderness. On average, 6 people a year are injured by bears in Alaska. A predatory attack is incredibly rare, and it is one that is difficult to avoid. Even if all the protocols are followed to a T, it's very difficult to stop a predatory attack. Richard and Kathy had been incredibly unlucky on that fateful night, a rare encounter with a predatory grizzly bear who tragically brought them to their terrifying final affliction. The city of Anchorage has the most population in the entire state, making it the chief commercial center. It lies at the base of the Chugach Mountains, a section of western North America's Pacific mountain range entirely contained inside the U.S. state of Alaska. The intrinsically delicate balance of the urban pillars in the foreground meeting the unsullied mountains of Chugach is the perfect symbolism for this city, a place anchored between nature and culture. Naturally, the people here have a heart for nature and love experiencing the beautiful landscape. Bird Ridge Mountain is one of the most popular sites where people can bathe their senses in the brilliant ecosystem. It is located southeast of Anchorage, along the Turnagain arm of Cook Inlet. It is home to the Robert Spur Memorial Hill event. This annual 3,400-foot uphill race climbs through the coastal forest to the tundra atop Bird Ridge Mountain, where people get an excellent view of the Turnagain arm and the surrounding mountains. On June 18, 2017, Father's Day, the Robert Spur Memorial Hill climb was celebrating its 29th year. It was a relatively cloudy day in Anchorage. Since the early morning, the sun had been overcast by the dull gray clouds. It loomed over the Cooper residence. Patrick Cooper and his mother, Katrina, had just finished their preparations for the race. Katrina carefully instructed Patrick on where to go, what to do, and how to stay away from the highway. With all the details ironed out, it was time for them to head out. It was 9:30 a.m., and nothing was seemingly out of the ordinary. Patrick was excited to participate in this race, as he was naturally competitive with all the school activities he had joined. Running this trail with his mother was extra special. Patrick would be joining the juniors division of the race, while Katrina would be in the adult division. It was a few minutes before they began. Patrick and Katrina, along with the other participants, had just arrived at the starting point. Unbeknownst to the Coopers, this event would change their lives forever. Katrina switched her phone to airplane mode, saving as much battery life as she could while the race was ongoing. Patrick was beside her, lightly springing with eagerness as he was having the time of his life. When Patrick was born at the Providence, Alaska Medical Center, he spent nearly 2 months in the neonatal intensive care unit. Born a premature baby, Patrick had a lot of problems and disabilities. Eventually, the doctors discovered he had a seizure disorder, autism, and ADHD. After being released from the hospital, Patrick spent another 2 months with his birth family. However, his parents, being disabled people themselves, eventually realized they were inadequately equipped to care for Patrick's special needs. They came to the difficult conclusion of putting him up for adoption. Eventually, Patrick met the Coopers, and Katrina and her then-husband Dave were immediately awestruck at the young boy's bright energy. Although Patrick had challenges, he did not let them stop him from enjoying life. He was a bright character. He liked to run and often competed with the fastest kids. He fished, inner tubed at the lake, and was an immense hockey fan who would watch the games with his family. Chess and Monopoly were big in the Cooper household, eventually turning Patrick into a massive fan of the games. Patrick may have experienced some difficulties at school. However, he did not let that affect his progress. At the time of the race, he had just finished 10th grade. Although a little bit gassed out, Katrina and Patrick reached halfway up the grueling foot race. The 16-year-old boy beamed a smile toward his mother as they approached the end of the junior version of the race. Reaching the end, Patrick had to say goodbye to Katrina for now. The boy looked at his adoring mother and gave her another beaming smile. Katrina put her arm around the boy, calling him her little mountain goat. She told him they'll see each other again later. since the adult's finish line was atop the steep mountain slope. After one last look at him, Katrina said goodbye and proceeded to head up the trail again. Patrick began to head back down the trail along with the other kids. Unfortunately, this was the last time Katrina would see her son alive. The downhill trail was a less challenging route, but it was by no means easier. However, the other kids accompanying Patrick made the time pass by more quickly. They chatted and laughed. They celebrated that the hard part of the race was already finished. The carefree atmosphere among the kids was infectious, and Patrick lost focus. Coming upon a confusing junction along the trail, Patrick decided to take a different turn away from the other kids. Unfortunately, it was a wrong and fatal turn. Here, nobody was walking alongside Patrick. He noticed the vegetation got denser as he trudged along the route, not connected to the race circuit. He continued to descend the trail and things became quieter. As the laughing of the young participants faded slowly in the background, the hush of the Alaskan wilderness became more prominent. Patrick could hear the rustling of the leaves as he stepped on them. Unwittingly walking farther down the trail, Patrick heard sounds in the bushes. At the same time, he finally realized nobody was walking with him anymore, prompting him to pause and attempt to rejoin the group. However, they were nowhere to be found. Suddenly, from a few feet away, Patrick noticed something hiding in the bushes, a massive black silhouette. The 16-year-old boy unintentionally crossed paths with a black bear. The creature blocked the path Patrick came from, effectively separating him farther away from the crowd. Patrick paced deeper into the wrong trail as the bear sized him up, stalking and following his every step. The young boy felt the dread looming over him. Patrick paced his steps more quickly and began to reach for his phone. Alarmed by the dire situation, Patrick texted his mother and brother but got no response from them. As he watched the bear carefully, Patrick left out a few voicemails. The bear eventually made its move and charged toward Patrick. It advanced with such speed, the distance between them seemed nothing. Patrick was sweating up a storm as he sensed the danger he was in. Fully panicked at this point, Patrick turned his back and decided to make a run for it. Unfortunately, it was a big mistake. The bear's senses quickly turned predatory. The worst mistake a person can make when encountering any predator is to attempt to outrun the creature. Predators operate more dangerously when they know their prey has no chance against them. And with his back against the bear, Patrick was an easy target. With its big and powerful legs, the bear pounced on the young boy, mauling him and quickly dragging him away. The creature used its powerful paws laced with 2-inch claws to hold him down. The bear began biting Patrick, chewing at his legs, face, and arms with its 3-inch canines that could snap bones in half. The young Patrick had no chance at all. Back at the starting area, Katrina noticed something was amiss. Patrick was not there when he should have reached the meetup point before her. Patrick's brother Jesse informed her of what happened. After receiving the distressing call from his brother, Jesse notified Brad Prikoski, the race director, about the situation. Brad immediately alerted race crews to search for Patrick. Katrina was understandably shocked, and she immediately joined in the search. Unfortunately, after a few hours, some responders were able to locate Patrick. He was already lifeless, and the black bear was still on top of him, guarding his kill. Immediately, a Chugach State Park ranger shot the bear in the face. However, it wasn't enough to kill it, prompting the creature to get away. As Patrick's remains were airlifted from the scene, the Coopers could do nothing but weep at his horrible fate. "We are all better people for the honor of having him in our lives. He will be dearly missed," said Patrick's family. The authorities scoured the area for the bear and were able to kill a 250-pound male black bear. They noticed it had been shot with a slug in the face, concluding they got the bear that killed Patrick. Experts weighing in on the case deemed the incident a rare predatory attack. The bear was not defending its cubs or a kill. It just so happened that it saw Patrick as an easy target, taking yet another amazing person to meet their unfortunate final affliction. Kellyanne and Michael Walz lived on a picturesque property set on a hilltop, surrounded by friendly neighbors who they got along very well with. Looking at the pair, you'd never suspect them of being different from any other married couple. But in reality, they had a very unusual hobby. Michael and Kellyanne liked to collect animals, and not just any animals. They had an affinity for exotic predators. You'd think that the neighbors would be worried about all of these murderous creatures in such close proximity to their homes and children. But according to them, the Walzes were excellent pet owners. Their cages were sturdy and secure. They had all of the proper licensing, and they passed every annual inspection of their property. The neighbors even made a game of spooking their visitors with the roars that echoed across the outskirts of Ross Township, Pennsylvania. In 1994, Michael procured a license to house exotic animals from across the seas, and they spent the next few years slowly filling their property with all sorts of dangerous meat eaters that could growl the pants off even the bravest men. A lion, 2 serval cats, a jaguar, a tiger, and a leopard. But their biggest and most loved animal was a fully grown black bear by the name of Teddy. Michael had the paperwork that gave him the right to sell and trade the animals that they kept. He could have even charged the public to visit his property like a mini zoo, but that wasn't what Michael and Kellyanne were about. They just adored creatures that would normally scare the rest of us senseless. They saw the beauty in them where others couldn't, and if the neighbors were ever worried, well, they were encouraged to come and inspect the property themselves. The couple loved nothing more than to share their love for wild animals with their acquaintances, and their community found the pair and all of their animals quite charming. Even their next-door neighbor, Scott Castone, who had 2 young children, spoke very highly of the Walzes and what stellar animal keepers they were. He never once worried that the carnivorous cats would escape. Scott inspected their cages himself, and he visited his friends all the time, often bringing his own kids along. But it would be this very complacency that was to blame for the events that unfolded on that fateful day of October 2009. Kellyanne herself raised Teddy since he was a cub, and the couple spoiled him with treats and attention. Teddy's favorite snack was popcorn, and he was Kellyanne's pride and joy. Teddy was 350 pounds of pure muscle that was kept behind a 15 by 15 foot steel and concrete cage. In nature, black bears aren't exactly known for their tolerance of humans, but the handful that have been kept by people are reported to be much more mild-mannered than grizzlies. Unless it comes to food and they're young, then black bears are just as likely as any other wild animal to get aggressive. It's just in their natures, and no amount of training can override natural instinct. And to bring an even more serious tone to this situation, Teddy was even bigger than his kind normally grew to be. He had always been fed the best food. He never had to fight to survive, and he had never known sickness or hard times. Teddy was a black bear in his prime. Not only was he unimaginably strong and heavy, he stood at a height that was twice as tall as a man. The 6th of October was a Sunday, and the day started off cold and wet. A typical muggy fall morning in Pennsylvania, and a typical day for Kelly. After Michael left for the day, she and her own 2 children headed out bright and early to feed their many animals. Sunday was also the day that Kelly cleaned all of the cages on their land, so this was going to be a long and busy morning for her. Her first stop was always Teddy's cage. Kelly never missed a day where she didn't greet her beloved Teddy first. Kelly waved to her neighbor Scott over the fence. He was already up and about with his own 2 children, tending to some odd jobs around his house that he'd been putting off all week. Scott's kids waved hello to their friends before turning back to help their father. Kelly's children hung back on the porch. The night's sleep hadn't quite left them, and they were still too groggy to show much enthusiasm for the day just yet. But Kelly didn't mind. She loved spending her mornings with the animals, and most of all, with Teddy. She rode the wheelbarrow right to the edge of the cage's door. She needed to shovel up Teddy's messes before laying down some fresh straw to keep his paws clear of the muddy ground. But before she entered the cage, Teddy got a shovelful of food. That shovel wasn't going to be enough to fill the gigantic bear's stomach, but it was enough to keep him occupied while she wheeled her tools in through the door. It's not like she wanted to keep Teddy occupied enough to ignore herself. He'd never shown any aggression toward Kelly after all, but she did want to keep Teddy busy enough not to notice the open door. The bear wouldn't hesitate to leave his enclosure if he was given half the chance, but food was an even bigger incentive than freedom, so Teddy never even bothered to look up from his breakfast while Kelly got busy. Teddy knew the drill by now, and he was excitedly awaiting his treat. Standing on his hind legs, he pawed at the cage and growled a deep good morning to his owner. Teddy was going through the usual motions because that was what was expected of him. But, in truth, Teddy was not in a good mood at all. Everything in Teddy's body was telling him that it was time to go into hibernation. Autumn was in full swing, and this is usually the time when black bears got ready to take that long slumber. Teddy had been pacing his cage for the past week, back and forth, looking for a way out to get to the woods where he belonged. The frustration was building up, and his owners, who usually saw him during the excitement of feeding time, didn't notice the bear's growing agitation. But for now, Teddy was seemingly happily rooting around in his pile of food. Kellyanne dragged the wheelbarrow inside with the shovel in hand, and the first few shovels of waste bedding that she hauled into the wheelbarrow went without incident. When her load was nearly overflowing, she put her shovel aside and turned to wheel the first load of mess out the door. But this sudden movement was all that Teddy needed to awaken that primal force within him. His natural instinct to protect his food, coupled with that volatile irritation that came with the need to hibernate outside in nature, just exploded out of the animal. Teddy did not see the woman who raised him, he just saw a potential threat. And with speed that belied his massive size, the beast landed on Kellyanne in one smooth bound. The air in Kelly's lungs whooshed out of her as almost 400 pounds rammed her to the ground, and by the time there was air in her lungs again to scream, Teddy had already had his jaws sunk into her shoulder. The ferocious roars and Kelly's screaming traveled to Scott's yard. He looked up with a frown that quickly turned into a look of horror when he saw the bloodbath that was unfolding in front of him. The air was alive with noise. Both his and Kelly's children were screaming hysterically. Kelly's kids had run into the house the moment the bear attacked. His enclosure was open, and they were going to be next if they didn't get out of the way fast. Scott leapt into action. It took him 30 seconds to run to his house, get his sidearm, load it, and sprint across his yard. When he reached Teddy's enclosure, Kelly was lying motionless on the ground, just a few feet from the open door. If Scott didn't know what happened, he never would have recognized the torn and broken human being that lay before him. Teddy was still on top of her. He gave the body one last shake, and when it became clear that his target was deceased, Teddy turned to the next threat before him, and that threat was Scott. The man was only a few feet away. Teddy could cover that distance in just 4 strides, but Scott was ready. The bear went low, gearing to storm at Scott on all fours, but before the beast could take 2 steps, Scott pulled the trigger, and he pulled it again and again and again. The first bullet hit Teddy in the abdomen. His thick fur and copious amounts of fat shielded him from most of the damage. It wasn't nearly enough to bring him down. Teddy recoiled from the blast, but he recovered in a split second and took a step forward. Then the second round hit him, and that was the lethal one. It hit the creature in the neck. Even without the shots that followed, that torn airway rendered his breathing obsolete. The animal hit the earth with a force that shook the ground like a freight train went past. Even the children inside the house felt the shockwave from the floorboards beneath their feet. Of the 5 shots fired, Scott managed to get 2 into the animal's skull. Even if Teddy had enough oxygen left in him for one last attack, those final rounds were more than enough to cut any remaining signs of life short instantly. And with that, 2 beings lay dead on the ground. Kellyanne, a woman who left behind 2 children and a husband who adored her, and yet now her torn and broken body lay under the canopy of the autumn rain, forever gone from this world. A life ended in less than a minute, and the other was a majestic beast, the iconic black bear that millions of stuffed toys are modeled after. If it weren't for the screams of the children, Scott would have stared at the gruesome scene in shock for hours. Next door, Scott's kids called 911 when they heard the shots ring out, but the paramedics just arrived to remove the bodies. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. Scott and all of the children are traumatized by the events of the day. Scott can at least find solace in the fact that his actions almost certainly saved lives. If Teddy had made it out of the Walz's yard, the bear, already in a blind rage, would have attacked the first living thing that he came across. But these events did leave plenty of food for thought. How could Kelly have just left that gate wide open? Why was there no separate holding cage to keep the bear in while she cleaned? But the Walz's neighbors came to their defense. In all ways, Kellyanne did everything that the state required of an exotic keeper, and the bear was, by all accounts, tame and friendly. The fact of the matter is, no matter how young you get them, wild animals are just that, wild animals. Complacency is not a sin. Kellyanne has done this routine 1,000 times with no problems at all. Number 1001 just happened to be the perfect storm. The change in season, food to protect, and natural instincts were just the perfect recipe for disaster. So while the news spread and the world had plenty of criticism to throw at the situation, there are children who lost their mother, a husband who lost his wife, and a whole community left reeling in shock. And then there's Scott Castone, the man who did not hesitate to face down one of the biggest animals that walks on land to save his friend, his children, and the community at large. There are two lessons that we can take away from this terrible event. One is that animals belong in the wild, no matter how much we love them and even how much they love us. Natural instinct is stronger than love for the creatures that are wild. And secondly, we can celebrate the bravery of the members of our community. Scott couldn't save Kellyanne, but he did save others from being attacked. There are still heroes out there willing to put their lives on the line so others won't have to meet their terrifying final affliction. Respected Zaxlip elder Bernice Evelyn Adolph was 72 years old. She was an active member of the First Nations community in Canada's British Columbia. As an elder, Bernice's decisions were respected within the community. On many occasions, she came across bears on her property. They were growing bolder by the day, and some even attempted to enter her home. But when tribal police offered to step in and destroy or relocate the nuisance bears, Bernice insisted that they left them alone. Bears were part of her people. They were part of the very nature that she believed they should protect. But the regular occurrence of the bears should have served as a stark warning that there was danger just around the corner. In British Columbia, there are estimated to be around 15,000 grizzly bears and more than 120,000 black bears. Although bear attacks across Canada are relatively rare, they are most likely to occur in Alberta and British Columbia, owing to their large bear populations. Chief Art Adolph of the Zaxlip community knew that ignoring the bears was dangerous, but he needed to respect the elders' wishes. She was very popular within the community, with many calling her aunt and looking up to her. But even she was growing anxious about the bears. Just before the fateful day, she asked tribal police to remove a nuisance bear peacefully and without harm. When she was told that it would be better to shoot the bear, she told them to leave them alone. Those were her final wishes, and nobody knows exactly what happened after that, but it was a brutal and tragic ending. It was June 2011, and Bernice hadn't been heard from for several days. Her daughter was growing increasingly worried for her mother's welfare. She hadn't been able to contact her and called upon tribal police to scout out her property. When officers arrived, there was no answer at the door, although there were suspicious marks on the framework. They looked like the claw marks of a bear. It had tried to get inside the house, either considering Bernice herself as prey or to investigate food inside the home. When officers scoured the garden for any other signs, one of their police dogs began barking. They released it, and it immediately ran off into the surrounding scrub. The officers followed it closely, and that's when they found a body. It was badly mauled. hardly recognizable, and it was partially concealed under a pile of pine needles and dirt. The bear, or bears, were planning on returning and finishing the meal. Nobody knows for sure how Bernice died. Some suggested, or at least hoped, that she may have passed away and then her body was consumed by bears. But sadly, when the autopsy was performed, it was found that she was killed by the bears themselves. The injuries she sustained were consistent with a bear attack, and it seemed that it was likely a predatory attack. Between grizzly and black bears are more likely to carry out a predatory attack, and the majority of fatal black bear attacks are predatory in nature. It is very difficult to defend yourself against such a large predator that considers you as prey. A likely scenario was that Bernice was outside on her property when a predator detected her from a distance away. As Bernice was in her garden, the black bear approached. Stealthily, it moved through the trees, moving silently over the undergrowth. Bernice would have been unaware of the approaching danger. She would have only seen the bear when it was too late. She was just 150 yards away from the safety of her house. That was too far for her to run. Reaching top speeds of 35 miles per hour, it's impossible to outrun a charging bear. Instead, Bernice braced herself for the attack as the bear launched itself at her. It instinctively went for her face and neck, its long canines delivering devastating blows. Bernice tried to protect herself, clasping her hands around the back of her neck. With each swipe of its paw, the bear's claws ripped through her skin. The attack was brutal and relentless. All the protection she had provided for the bears, insisting that they were not harmed or removed from her property, counted for nothing as she was savagely attacked by the hungry bear. Although she put up a brave fight, Bernice succumbed to her injuries. She died alone, surrounded by the natural world that she felt at one with. The bear began its feast, and when it had its fill, it tried to bury Bernice, flicking pine needles and twigs onto her body, digging at the loose soil and covering her with it. The bear had now concealed her, something it planned to come back to later. But other bears had smelt the fresh kill and were drawn to the area. They rooted around in the undergrowth, following the scent of the body. They too tucked in, and by the time officers discovered Bernice, her body was in such a bad state that her identity needed to be confirmed using dental records. It was a gruesome and truly horrific discovery. Whilst the others in the community felt guilty for not having taken care of the bears before, they knew that it had been Bernice's wish. During the summer months, encounters between people and bears are more likely across North America and Canada. More people are out and about due to the weather, and bears are foraging in the wilderness. The year that Bernice was tragically killed had been an unusually wet spring. As a result, there were plentiful grass and berry harvests. Wildlife officers in the province had reported fewer complaints that season from bear encounters, as bears were less inclined to wander into communities to find food. Unfortunately for Bernice, however, this wasn't the case. Immediately, traps were set up to catch the bear or bears responsible. If a bear had killed a person in a predatory attack, then it was likely that it would attack again. Snares were deployed, carefully placed along well-worn bear paths around Bernice's property, and officers scoured the area from the skies, flying a helicopter low over the trees to track down any bears in the vicinity. There were plenty around. In the days following Bernice's death, a total of 5 bears were caught and euthanized. Officials knew that it was likely that they would have fed on Bernice's remains, even if they weren't responsible for her death, and that can be dangerous. Once they have a taste for human flesh, they are more likely to see people as prey. DNA analysis was carried out to determine whether they had caught the bear responsible. The saliva from one of those they euthanized matched saliva found on Bernice's clothing. Just 1 week after the tragic and fatal attack on Bernice, a man was badly mauled by a grizzly whilst picking berries along the coastline in British Columbia. Luckily, he survived. However, the 2 serious attacks sparked concern amongst locals. Steve Mitchell, who worked as a human-wildlife conflict specialist for Parks Canada in Banff, reiterated the advice for bear encounters. Most attacks are defensive. The bear is protecting its food, young, or has been startled and caught unaware. In this case, a person who comes face to face with a bear must try to prevent the urge to run. This will likely spark an innate reaction in the bear to pursue you. Instead, remain calm and back away slowly. If a bear is actively hunting you, then the outcome is often far worse, and usually the person doesn't see the bear approaching. They stalk their prey silently, creeping closer until they pounce. Predatory attacks are considered extremely rare, particularly by grizzlies, but in this instance, a person must fight back. The bears near Bernice's property had expressed an interest in her before. Their presence had been noted several times before, and there were clear indications that they had tried to break into her home. Rather than being frightened by people, the bears were drawn to them, eyeing Bernice for a rare predatory attack that took her to her terrifying final affliction. Amblipani Kohotra is a village located in the Dahod district in the southeast of India. It's one of those places that seems to have found a balance between the modern world and the old ways. Tribesmen in their traditional clothes walk the streets among the market stalls and cattle roaming free. Farmers still work and harvest from the land like their ancestors have done for thousands of years, and women stroll with baskets of produce balanced on their heads. The countryside is lush and wild, littered with jungle terrain, farmlands, and sanctuaries to keep the indigenous animals safe from poachers, as well as a convenient way for tourists to come and see them. Amblipani is nestled close to one of these sanctuaries, the Sloth Bear Reserve, set out to preserve the endangered Indian bear. The locals have all seen one of these magnificent animals at one point or another, and for the most part, the people stay as far away as possible from these animals. They are by nature aggressive animals, unlike their black and grizzly cousins who will avoid people unless protecting their young or scared. They prefer to be left to their own devices, something that the people of Dahod are more than happy to give them. December in India is a quiet time in nature. This is usually when mothering animals retreat into the overgrowth to spend the last few months with their young before setting them off by themselves when spring arrives. Also, there is more food the farther away from people they move. And given that this is the dry time of the year, the animals only come out when food is at its scarcest. And that seems to be the case for a mother sloth bear and her cub. She'd had her pair of cubs 2 months ago, but the smaller of the two had already died. It was much weaker than its sibling, and the scarce winter foliage and the struggle of fighting its larger and stronger brother for milk had just been too much for the young cub. The female was incredibly protective of her only remaining offspring. She didn't much like going so close to the human settlements, but that's where the food led her to go, and she needed to feed herself and her cub if they were going to see the new growth in spring. On that day in 2021, the bear and her cub on her back were rooting for termites and bugs among the hollows of tree roots. That morning, Sanjali Rathwa was also looking for food, but not for herself. The 42-year-old needed to get her cattle out to graze as early as she could. Even in winter, India is still warm, albeit dry. Sanjali led the herd into the canopy of the trees before the sun could get high, and they could at least find some shade while her animals ate to their heart's content. Sanjali genuinely enjoyed the quiet and stillness of the wilderness, with only the sounds of birds and the crunch of hooves to break the silence. The first 3 hours went as expected, and Sanjali even found a spot to rest underneath a tree for a good hour before the herd started moving deeper into the bush. She sighed, but decided that there were plenty of other places to keep herself company with her own thoughts, wherever else the cows decided to graze, and set off after them. The sloth bear, with her cub still riding on her back, became acutely aware of the approaching herd of bovines. She yipped at her baby to keep him quiet and made her way up the nearest tree to safety. It was best to wait until the creatures passed before she got back on the ground. But to her already vexed agitation, the cows settled right around the tree she was hiding in. It was not a very high vantage point, barely 2 meters tall, and she didn't feel especially well hidden. Intermingled with the smell of herbivores, there was another scent, a human scent, that she didn't like at all. Humans were loud and dangerous. She avoided them at all costs, especially now that she had a young one to take care of. And to the bear's great unease, the human walking behind the herd started walking over to the very tree she was hidden in. Minutes dragged by, the woman below in the shade, completely unaware of the animals above her. The mother sloth bear and her cub were so camouflaged that they practically disappeared into the foliage above. The cub's long weight on its mother's back, with only her breathing to lull it into a stupor, slowly drifted off to sleep. Its claws relaxed, and before the mother could stop him, he went tumbling through the branches. The black cub, which resembled a small dog more than a bear, landed with a thump on Sanjali's crossed legs. She let out a startled yell when the flailing baby bear landed on her. Her shout set several things in motion all at once. A flock of birds shot into the air. Her herd of cows took off running in fright, and the mother bear above Sanjali's head let out a roar of panic and anger. She leapt off the branches just as the woman looked up at the sound from above and landed with her full 200-pound weight on top of Sanjali's head, claws already outstretched. Her nails dug into Sanjali's neck and cheeks, tearing and ripping at every inch of her that they could reach in a frenzied attack. The woman was crushed beneath the immense weight of the fully grown bear, and she could only try to grab hold of the thick and coarse fur in an attempt to get it off of her. But it was of no use. Sanjali, weighing only 120 pounds at most, was no match for the mother in full protection mode. The claws on her neck yanked away, tearing out a large chunk of muscle and skin. The arterial spray that evacuated the wound coated Sanjali, the bear, and the tree in bright red blood. The animal rolled off, got its feet under it again, and went after the screaming woman once more. Sanjali's hands went to her throat the moment the weight was off her, trying desperately to stem the torrent of blood. On her knees, she attempted to get up to run, but she'd lost so much blood so quickly that her knees promptly gave in on her. And then the creature was on top of her again, her jaws closing over Sanjali's whole face. Her teeth sank into Sanjali's skull and under her jaw. The animal shook Sanjali like she weighed nothing, and Sanjali was already too weakened from her injuries to pose any resistance. Her limbs flayed with the force, and her body was limp. The bear shook her a second time and realized that the human had stopped moving. She released Sanjali's head, and the woman lay lifelessly on the ground. A sniff was enough to assure the mother bear that the human was no longer a threat. So she left Sanjali there to bleed to death under the tree and to find her cub, which had stayed hidden behind a large boulder nearby. She decided it was safer to live off less food in the deep jungle after all, and the pair trotted into the foliage, never to be seen again. The day wore on, with no one in the village having any idea of the horrendous tragedy that had occurred to their neighbor. It was only when the small herd of cattle, driven by schedule and the knowledge of where their shelter was, came walking back into town, that the people realized that something was very, very wrong indeed. Their handler was not with the cows, and they set out to look for her, hoping that she'd taken a fall or maybe fainted in the heat of the day. But by nightfall, after not finding any trace of Sanjali, the authorities were called in to assist in the search. While the village took care of her worried children, the night dragged on. It wasn't until the next morning that Sanjali's remains were finally found. She'd been almost completely scalped from her jaw to the base of her neck, and what was left of her neck was nothing but a raw, shredded open wound. Authorities could at least determine what had attacked her, and that her death had been relatively quick. The sloth bear's first clawing had severed the jugular and main arteries. Sanjali had lost consciousness before the rest of her scalping had occurred in the second wave of the attack. There was a funeral, paid for by the state, and attended by everyone in the village, old and young. The only sloth bear attack of 2021 in India was a fatality, and the victim was a mother, a sister, and a beloved resident of her community, who unfortunately met her terrifying final affliction. The Ypres Creek Trail System is a network of biking and hiking paths that wind through the boreal forest. It is surrounded by towering trees and offers breathtaking vistas of the infamous Canadian Rocky Mountains. As you make your way along the trails, you'll see a diverse array of wildlife including bison, elk, exotic birds, deer, and black and grizzly bears. If lucky enough, one can spot trout fish jumping to catch low-flying insects on the Ghost River, which joins the Bow River at the Ghost Lake. The trails also offer a strenuous, challenging workout through the rocky terrain and steep inclines. However, no matter how difficult the hiking or biking is, the views are always worth it. It is a must-visit destination for anyone seeking adventure and a connection with Mother Nature. Dr. David Lertzman was a 59-year-old senior instructor at the University of Calgary. He was an assistant professor of sustainable development and environmental management at the university's Haskayne School of Business. He had a passion for the environment and organized week-long wilderness retreat courses in Kananaskis, where students would be taught how to use their senses in navigation and also meditation to find their places in the environment. He and his wife Sarah Lertzman lived near Ypres Creek, northwest of Calgary. Their home's location provided unlimited access to the hiking trail system near Ghost River, where David would trail run twice a day as he sought his deep connection with nature. On Tuesday, 4th of May 2021, the clocks were ticking at 6 p.m. when Dr. David left home for his second run of the day. He chose the Moss Trail as his preferred path as it wound its way through towering cliffs, ascending higher and higher into the hill. He relished the challenge ahead, and his feet pounded the ground as he stepped into the trail. He let his eyes adjust to the dimming light because the day was drawing to a close. He took a moment and soaked in the beauty of his surroundings. He felt the wind carrying the sounds of the night whip past him and instantly invigorate his senses. From the nearby chirping of crickets to the distant bellows of bison, the woods were about to come to life. He saw a high embankment along the trail where he paused to catch his breath. He stood close to its edge and decided to enjoy the breathtaking views from the top of the embankment. He stood still as he let his eyes wander until they fell on something interesting. Far below, he could see the twinkling lights of the town, a reminder of the never-sleeping world he had left behind. Up there, he felt 1,000,000 miles away, as though on top of the world, surrounded by the stillness and beauty of nature. He had never felt so alive and so connected to the wilderness around him as he did at that very moment. He was lost in thought, soaking up the peace and quiet of the wild. However, unbeknown to him, a female grizzly bear and her cub were feeding nearby and had heard him approach the embankment. Without warning, the sow grizzly appeared from the underbrush and silently sneaked up behind him. With his eyes gazing at the distant sea of lights, Dr. David was so absorbed in the view that he didn't notice that a grizzly was fast approaching until it was too late. Back at home, Sarah was beginning to fill with a sense of urgency and fear. It was almost 10 p.m., and her husband was long overdue from his run. Her husband would always return home after an hour or two in the woods, but it was now 4 hours since he left, and there was still no sign of him. Knowing the trail her husband normally took, she grabbed her coat and bravely set out, hoping that David was only injured or lost and unable to come back to the trail. She knew that being out in the wild by herself was unsafe, but for the love of her husband, she was willing to face her fears. With her torch as the only source of light in the darkness, she hiked on the rugged moss trail as her heart pounded away in her chest. The path was rocky and steep, and she found herself stumbling more than once, but she was not one to give up easily. She pressed on, her torch beam cast eerie shadows on the bushes, rocks, and trees around her, with the sounds of the night echoing in the air, constantly scaring her. She had never felt so alone and so far from the safety of her home. She searched and searched, but David was nowhere to be seen. As the night wore on, her feet were growing weary, exhaustion kicked in, and she was slowly giving up. She decided it was time to notify the authorities. Just before midnight, she called Cochrane Royal Canadian Mounted Police and notified them of her missing husband. The authorities then launched a search, and a team consisting of a helicopter with a spotlight and police dogs were dispatched. For the next 2 hours, the search party combed the rugged terrain as they retraced David's steps. Just after 2 a.m. Wednesday, the search crew found David's lifeless body, crumpled off Moss Trail near Ghost River. The rescue team immediately transported his body to the coroner for medical examination. The officers closed the trail system as investigations into the incident were launched. An autopsy on Dr. David's body revealed the most puzzling and intriguing grizzly encounters ever recorded. The grizzly had attacked from behind and pushed David off the 900-foot cliff. David had then tumbled down to the bottom of the cliff near Ghost River. His wounds were consistent with an instantaneous death being his fate. Track evidence on the hiking trail showed that a single female grizzly that was accompanied by her cub was involved in the attack. The authorities discerned that it was not a predatory attack and that the cub was not involved. Sarah was deeply devastated by her husband's demise, given that she had stood at the exact spot of the attack while searching for him and didn't detect any signs of the attack. She had stood on the cliff above her husband without knowing. After all, she was looking for a man in distress and not for a scene of something bad that had happened. However, the authorities cautioned her against going back to the hiking trails, as she also could have suffered the same fate if the bear had seen her. As reality set in, a deep cloud of sadness engulfed her as she replayed their moments together in her mind. Her cries turned to whimpers, and for the longest time, she was inconsolable. The grief was like a shard in her gut that wouldn't just go away. However, she hoped that with time, the edges would dull. Bears come out of their dens in spring, making it a dangerous period to be in the wild. This is because they are usually hungry and wandering to where they had their last meal before the winter came. This was suspected by the Canmore Fish and Wildlife officers to be the fueling factors of the bear's behavior. Following the attack, the officers set baited traps in a bid to capture the bear and understand why this dreadful attack had happened. Unfortunately, 3 weeks after the grim attack, there was still no bear activity detected in the area. The officers concluded that the sow and her cub were no longer in the area of the attack and removed the traps to mitigate the risk of inadvertently attracting other predators to the trails. They then scaled back their investigation and reopened the trail system to the public after marking it safe to use. The local community at large was saddened by the horrific turn of events and held a memorial in remembrance of Dr. David Lertzman. The University of Calgary's dean, Dr. Jim DeWald, eulogized David as a friend to all and a spiritual leader committed to their Indigenous connections. He also added that Dr. David had a profound impact on thousands of students and colleagues. Over the years, he had noted that many of the students Dr. David had taught would come back to him and tell him how his course had changed their lives for the better. The University of Calgary's flag was lowered on May 6th in honor of his service to the community. The authorities reminded people in the backcountry of the need to use marked paths and trails, watch for fresh signs of bear activity, make noise, and always carry bear spray and know how to use it while out in the woods. Failure to do so may result in your untimely final affliction.